So we have this situation of a steward who is being fired for squandering his master's property. That sounds like a good reason to be fired. But the guy has chutzpah, guts, and he's come up with a scheme that he thinks will, that people will be delighted to have him be in their home. He writes promissory notes that are less than what they actually owe the master. And he thinks by this cheating scandal, he thinks he'll get by with it, but he doesn't, because the master discovers this, and he says he's to be commended for his, what word was it? For his, I'm sorry, it was a word that just didn't fit. It was much more appropriate that he would be commended for his scheming ability, his craftiness, his cleverness. Didn't work, but he was crafty. For us, what does this mean? You and I are not unjust stewards, but we might do well to ask, what does stewardship mean? And its application. Because if there are, a little over 100 people here, there are probably 100 different applications of good stewardship. I can tell you some ingredients of good stewardship, and the first is a recognition that everything we are and everything we have comes from God. That's a good place to start, because initially you might say, well, yes, I agree with that, but then go through your stuff and all that you have. Which do you claim as God's? Which do you claim as yours? Okay, once we come to the recognition that everything is from God, then the most honorable thing to do is to thank God. To thank God for all that we are and all that we have. So that's the second point. And then the third, how do we use the gifts that God has given us? And so it would seem that all of us, or most of us, have some basic responsibilities. And the first responsibility is to give back to God a portion of what he has given us. And like I said, that portion would be different for everyone here. But what would be a just and generous portion? And we're talking, yes, about money, but we're also talking about time and the talents that we have. Do I use them wisely and well and give a just and generous portion back to God? You know, that's something that you and I need to stand before the Lord and say, I believe this to be the case. And then, of course, you know, as time and circumstances change, we may have to revise our giving back to God. And then, of course, we have our family responsibilities, and there are times in a family's life where those are very demanding. And so we need to recognize those responsibilities to spouse, to children, perhaps to grandchildren. And again, that varies from person to person. And then listening to the scriptures, the poor. Amos really laid it on heavy about how we can trample the poor because we have more than they do. So along with giving God his portion, giving the poor a just and generous portion. And again, that can take so many different forms. But that's sometimes one that we can kind of shove to the side. But the poor are very dear to God, and he doesn't want us to ignore them. They come in many different shapes and forms. Sometimes they're shabby, sometimes they're very nicely dressed. Poor comes in many different forms. Well, so we've gone from God to family to poor. Well, we do need to save something for ourselves, don't we? And of course, we need to provide for our own needs and even our own wants. And that's a good thing. But again, that's what we pray about, and how do I use wisely and well the gifts that God has given me. And as I was reflecting on this, I came up with a few other ideas about how we might be good stewards. For those of us who are of a certain age, I'll let you figure out what that would be. How do we handle the stuff that we have, and we know that we can't take it with us? And most of us aren't hoarders, but most of us have an awful lot of stuff, and that we don't use or need. And many of us say, well, I'm in the process of downsizing. But that's a very slow process, isn't it? I think good stewardship is to use wisely and well what we've been given, and to plan for the future of this stuff that we have. Isn't it somewhat irresponsible to say, well, I'll let my kids take care of it? That's a big burden. And to do what we can to give what we have that we don't use, that we don't need, but we also want our loved ones to have it. Let's do our part in sharing. Now, those of us who are of another age, maybe we need to examine how we use the gift of our screen time. Television, computers, videos. Is there excess there? I know someone, and I admire him very much. He's going to be 50 years old, and he's one of the most virtuous men I know. And yet he's an architect, and he spends all day looking at a computer. Is that necessary? Is that healthy? Is that good? Is it good use of God's gift of technology? Anyway, I do think the scriptures give us some reason to reflect. We start with the irresponsible steward, but then we have to look at our own stewardship. We like to think we are responsible stewards, but maybe there are areas where we need to examine. And again, we finish where we started, by recognizing that everything we have and are is from God, and we need to give him thanks and praise. And at every age and stage, to reevaluate how we do that. As we pray today, let's ask the Lord for the grace to recognize his gifts and our responsibility to his gifts.